Well, hello everyone. It is Super Steam Saturday on a beautiful, beautiful May day, and it's glorious. Everything's in bloom. And our special guest today is Michael Naylor, and he is going to talk about why, being a scientist, you really, really should be, an artist too, and the connection and how those two things really can go together. So if you are coming on and you don't want your image to show on the screen, we are recording. So please, turn your webcam off. Other than that, please enjoy. I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you. So yeah, just to begin, the premise of this is not only do we think that scientists need to be artists, in fact, to be creative and artistic in the manner by which they approach their science, but like in the exact same formula, musicians and artists need to be scientists. We need to be very calculated and disciplined in what we do. Everything about music, for example, the physics of sound create vibration, and pitch is a refined vibration which we measure in hertz. Everything about rhythm is math. And so there is nothing that is exclusive. And so we'll talk a little bit about the history of how we got into this kind of exclusive set of mindsets. But then particularly, we're going to talk about creativity, about artistry, and about altruism, which is using our creativity in science, particularly for the benefit and well-being of humanity. So we'll kind of go through and break these into small processes. I'm really grateful to see you all here today. And by any means, if at any point along the line, if you'd like to go ahead and interject, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to just go ahead and unclick mute and jump right in, because we're a small group of folks, and that's perfectly okay. So I'm going to go ahead and start the process here. First of all, very often when we think of creativity, we hear the term thinking outside the box. And if we think, when were you the most creative? When were you the best learner and the more naturally predisposed to thinking outside the box? And I think most of us would say, would recognize when we were children. And the truth of the matter is, and I frequently say for all forms of learning, if you can remember your 5-year-old or your 7-year-old, if you can remember that time when everything was about questions and everything was about moving on and what else can be and what's behind that, that was the time period when we truly were able to think outside the box. People use the term, but don't understand that thinking outside the box is an actual discipline. One of my favorite quotes relates to the potential that STEM sciences and the arts are not, in fact, separate disciplines, but collaborative and partners in the manner by which we look at problem solving and look for the discovery of reality, and look for the manner by which we want to improve the conditions and qualities of the world. So even though they very often have different outcomes, they have a unifying process. And this unifying process could be defined as creative problem solving. Because when I compose a composition, when I sit down to write a song, I immediately invest myself in a process that has a direct parallel. We call it scientific method in science. And that is this aspect of creative problem solving. One of my favorite all-time quotes is one that is not very often attributed to or very often quoted from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But he says, "The hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined nonconformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood." And the reason I bring this up, because I think those two words, disciplined nonconformity, are precisely the marriage of STEM and arts, because discipline is that ultimate ability that scientists bring to the world of problem solving and searching for reality, making sure that we prove and test things, and we work on scrutinizing what it is we're doing and trying to constantly discover more. But nonconformists, that's the world that the artist lives in. And in nonconformity, we're willing to say, okay, everything has been done this way, but what else could be out there? What is the pathway that we're not looking at? And in this in this combination of discipline nonconformity, we see the ability to be able to recognize that everything that we consider science today will not be science in the future. There will be new discoveries, and everything that is art today and everything that is creative today is no longer considered as creative as the creators of the future will be. So this constant discipline of being, or this, I would say, this progression of increasing our discipline nonconformity is critical. And you'll notice that Dr. King also says, as a social scientist, that we want to orientate our discoveries and include what we do in regards to a dedication to justice, peace, and brotherhood. And so if there isn't this also kind of altruistic component, we have to question the value of our science and the value of our arts. Now, I'll just give a quick kind of overarching view of the difference between critical thinking and creative thinking, because it's important to understand that they are not exclusive, but there is a component in creative thinking that is sometimes missed by critical thinking. Creativity was once considered the product of genius and divine inspiration. That is, for a period of nearly 1,000 years, there was always this attribute or attribution to spirituality and to a sense of connectivity to a higher power. And we'll kind of come back to that in a little bit. But over time, critical thinking became the process for academia, became the primary, I would say, rallying point by which academia evolved. Critical thinking, we seek to scrutinize the assumptions, reasoning, and evidence brought to bear on an issue. Such scrutiny is enhanced by placing practices in tension with alternatives. And so we know the scientific method and a lot of the things that we talk about in the construct of critical thinking are linked to this process of scrutiny and this process of placing things in tension with alternatives. What this also, however, has done is created a type of process of argumentation. And so we even teach argumentative thinking and argumentative writing. And very often argumentative thinking and argumentative writing is a non-inclusive but an exclusive process of discourse. And so the process of creative thinking is an inclusive process of discourse. We have a little bit less ownership on what we do and what we want and what we put out in the world. We want to work in collaborative learning communities. And we place a little bit more of a focus on the process of problem solving versus the specific outcome, and certainly increasingly less emphasis on argumentation. So as we look into the world of politics, as an example, we see this kind of bipolar party systems of Republican and Democrat. We see this argumentation, and it's almost an immediate polarization of the capacity to find truth. And we see this in a lot of things, as it has often also been between STEM and the arts. We see this kind of tension of polarization between them that has no real no reality in the constructs of our history, of the history of evolution of science and art, or in the actual compatibility of the two. So let's just look for a second at what is creative thinking. Creative thinking includes the generating of alternative ideas, practices, and solutions that are unique and effective in exploring ways to accommodate complex, messy, ambiguous problems, making new connections and seeing how things could be otherwise, or generate new insights with value to others. And I particularly like this UMass, University of Massachusetts Creative Studies definition because of the particular composition of exploring ways to accommodate complex, messy, ambiguous problems, making new connections. In other words, constantly looking at ways of creating an interdisciplinary learning communities, of understanding that if you're going to solve problems like cancer or global warming, that it has to include new ways of looking at living, or new ways of looking at eating, or looking at the way and manner by which we live, things that are outside molecular biology. And so when we began to start to look at the greatest problems, racism, gender inequity, global warming, all these types of things, we're very often confronted with problems that cannot be defined or solved within the constructs of a single discipline. And so that's where creativity basically comes in, as we start to see this kind of intermeshing of disciplines and intermingling of viewpoints. And so that's a good kind of call to arms for those of us that are artists and scientists to work together and begin to start to see the intermingling of our disciplines. Okay, I'm going to just play a little video. For years, this was the #1 TED Talk of all time. And I like it because it kind of puts a thumb on the pulse of how we teach and learn, including how we teach and learn this kind of opposition to creativity and artistry and STEM disciplines. And in particular begins to suggest that the importance of multiple intelligence learning and creative learning is also very important. And so this is Sir Ken Robinson. He's the late Ken Robinson. And this is a short little excerpt from what used to be, for, I would say, close to 15 to 20 years, the #1 TED Talk, viewed TED Talk of all time.
I have a big interest in education, and I think we all do. We have a huge vested interest in it, partly because it's education that's meant to take us into this future that we can't grasp. If you think of it, children starting school this year will be retiring in 2065. Nobody has a clue, despite all the expertise that's been on parade for the past 4 days, what the world will look like in 5 years' time. And yet we're meant to be educating them for it. So the unpredictability, I think, is extraordinary. And the third part of this is that we've all agreed, nonetheless, on the really extraordinary capacities that children have, their capacities for innovation. And my contention is all kids have tremendous talents, and we squander them pretty ruthlessly. So I want to talk about education, and I want to talk about creativity. My contention is that creativity now is as important in education as literacy, and we should treat it with the same status. Thank you. That was it, by the way. Thank you very much. So, 15 minutes left. Well, I was born... No, I had a great story recently, I love telling it, of a little girl who was in a drawing lesson. She was 6, and she was at the back drawing, and the teacher said this little girl hardly ever paid attention. And in this drawing lesson, she did. And the teacher was fascinated. She went over to her and she said, "What are you drawing?" And the girl said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher said, "But nobody knows what God looks like." And the girl said, "They will in a minute." What these things have in common is that kids will take a chance. You know, if they don't know, they'll have a go. Am I right? They're not frightened of being wrong. Now, I don't mean to say that being wrong is the same thing as being creative. What we do know is, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. If you're not prepared to be wrong. And by the time they get to be adults, most kids have lost that capacity. They have become frightened of being wrong. And we run our companies this, by the way. We stigmatize mistakes. And we're now running national education systems where mistakes are the worst thing you can make. And the result is that we are educating people out of their creative capacities. Picasso once said this. He said that all children are born artists. The problem is to remain an artist as we grow up. I believe this passionately, that we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it. Or rather, we get educated out of it. So why is this? In the next 30 years, according to UNESCO, more people worldwide will be graduating through education than since the beginning of history. More people. And it's the combination of all the things we've talked about, technology and its transformational effect on work, and demography and the huge explosion in population. Suddenly, degrees aren't worth anything. Isn't that true? When I was a student, if you had a degree, you had a job. If you didn't have a job, it's because you didn't want one. And I didn't want one, frankly. So, but now, kids with degrees are often heading home to carry on playing video games because you need an MA, where the previous job required a BA, and now you need a PhD for the other. It's a process of academic inflation, and it indicates the whole structure of education is shifting beneath our feet. We need to radically rethink our view of intelligence. We know 3 things about intelligence. 1, it's diverse. We think about the world in all the ways that we experience it. We think visually, we think in sound, we think kinesthetically, we think in abstract terms, we think in movement. Secondly, intelligence is dynamic. If you look at the interactions of a human brain, as we heard yesterday from a number of presentations, intelligence is wonderfully interactive. The brain isn't divided into compartments. In fact, creativity, which I define as the process of having original ideas that have value, more often than not, comes about through the interaction of different disciplinary ways of seeing things.
Okay, I'm going to stop there, and we'll kind of explore what those different disciplinary ways are of seeing things. But if we look at some of the world's greatest problems, we know one of the world's greatest problems, obviously, is the disinformation process that is becoming popular, particularly in Western cultures, that place the freedom of individual expression, saying whatever it is that's on my mind, ahead of the proof of science and the value of accurate information. And so one of the things that we'll obviously have to work on is being able to go ahead and understand that my ability to say something doesn't necessarily mean that what I'm saying has validity in the world of science or in the world of truth. But along with that, if we look at the world's problems, proliferation of nuclear weapons, increasing global population, availability of energy, obviously climate change, et cetera, the explosion in technology and world connectivity, global interdependence in climate, finance, health, and problem-solving, cancer, the pandemics, requires the rigor of science and creativity and concern of artistry. And this is from MIT. And so I'm going to just kind of give you a couple of quotes here. And the key component is to understand that most of the greatest scientists and the people that are out there that we value in many ways also considered themselves artists. This is from John North. Airplanes are not designed by science, but by art, in spite of some pretense to the contrary. I do not mean to suggest that engineering cannot do without science. On the contrary, it stands on scientific foundations. But there is a big gap between scientific research and the engineering product, which has to be bridged by the art of the engineer. And then a lifelong artist is Albert Einstein. After a certain high level of technical skill is achieved, and this is true, by the way, of all the arts as well, science and art tend to coalesce in aesthetics, plasticity, and form. The greatest scientists are always artists as well. And Albert Einstein, in repeated quotes, considered himself an artist and talked about his artistry, and in fact played violin whenever he was trying to problem solve. And so we know that this is, we know that this interconnectivity of artistry and science can be nurtured. All right, so very quickly, let's do a quick little backdraft of how we got to where we are, how we got to the separation of science and the arts, how we got to disciplinary separations, how we got to many of the things that we almost consider to be standard, including standardized testing and the industrial model of education. And we'll see that a lot of these are kind of myths, boundaries and myths that have been kind of constructed. All right, the first thing is we kind of go back to the beginning of education systems, and that was began with the Greek academies, the basic of documentation, even the basics of the scientific method. In the constructs of Greek philosophy, they actually, Aristotle and Socrates believed that spirituality and science were intermingled. That is, that the scientist or the ultimate scientist had to also rely on intuition and this kind of interconnection with the higher power to be able to begin to chart the flow. And so this idea of meditation or reflection based on a sense of humility and recognition that we are that the best of science and the best of inspiration artistic inspiration or scientific inspiration comes from this willingness to be a hollow reed and remove the ego and remove the self, which is also somewhat supportive of the fact that the very first universities evolved from what we call the Islam Golden Age, so kind of the beginning of Islam. The first two medical schools, both one in Morocco and one in Egypt, were the first two universities that granted degrees and created this the constructs of what we now refer to as medical science. And that eventually transferred on into European academies, and the medieval academies began the process of creating this scientific problem solving, the idea of research and citation, that is citing what's gone before, making sure that we've read what has already existed, that's already there, and using and building on that. And this is a process, obviously, we're going to want to continue with. But it also created this kind of disciplinary specialization, which has advantages, but in the constructs of the way we're looking at creativity and science today, it has disadvantages. In other words, for anybody in a STEM profession to not consider themselves an artist, or for anybody in the arts to not consider themselves a scientist, in many respects is kind of a demotion or a diminution of the human capacity to learn. And so we'll kind of look at that. Over time, some of the primary, I would say, boundaries to the altruistic and artistic fusion with science, and the consideration of science as being a way of problem solving our world's greatest problems for the benefit of humanity, was what I sometimes refer to as the lethal cocktail of imperialism, patriarchy, and competitive capitalism. We might add to this religious exceptionalism, because what this created was a pattern of conquering and doing things for material benefit. And so a huge percentage of sciences are linked to what it is that is profit, can create profit. Competitive capitalism is the ability to obviously push out those who are doing things. So among drug companies, the competition is always to create the drug first, get the drug out there, be the one that corners the market. Patriarchy is obviously this kind of ancient vision of males being dominant and in control. And of course, that led to the whole construct of imperialism. And so what we have here is a long practiced muscle. Imagine you're working out your muscles, your left and your right arm, and then you just give up on your left arm and you just continue to work on your right arm. Your right arm is going to become extremely strong, but your left arm is going to become lethargic and inept. Your muscle structures are not going to develop. Well, in like sense, this sense of collectivism and conscience, some refer to it as spirituality, but in any case, this sense of altruism and the benefit and view by which we create science and use science, and the conscience behind science and the conscience behind what we teach and learn, so much of it has evolved around materialism. Of course, we see that in the medical profession. We see that in many of the professions. To get a right-sized vision of kind of how we potentially could teach and learn, we might look at STEM fields as the exploration of physical reality in our planet and universe, and the key to answering questions about our physical reality, but then also blend that with arts, which requires this intuitive, spiritual, and humanistic conscious, this sense of altruism. And in that, we find the balance. So if we extricate what artists do for a living, which is imagine another world, imagine a world better, putting our thumb on the pulse of humanity, questioning things, and also having that kind of connectivity to a belief that we're only a channel through which truth or well-being flows, the sense of humility that is required. When you bring that into the scientific profession, you bring that conscience that is essential to making sure that what we do is of the greatest benefit to humanity. So let's just look at kind of old science and new science, just in terms of the brain itself. And brain science has grown tremendously in the last decade. One concept of old science was that there are right brain people who are intuitive and creative free thinkers and qualitative big picture thinkers. And then there's left brain people who tend to be more quantitative and analytical. They pay attention to details and are ruled by logic. And just as we thought that intelligence was something that you had, we had these IQ tests and things, we now know that intelligence is growing, that qualitative and quantitative thinking is an integral part that crosses the different hemispheres and different portions of the brain. And it's far more complex and far more accessible for all of us. And so there's new science, neurologic advancements in neuroplasticity, experiences and memories, aka learning, change of brain structural plasticity. In particular, I have a person that I worked with who did a talk for NIH, the National Institutes of Health, Wendy Suzuki. And she talks about brain plasticity as being grown by virtue of our willingness to have adventure, to travel, to learn languages, to practice instruments and to do art alongside the development of scientific quantitative and analytical thinking. And that the requirements for a full engaged brain demand this process. So we've talked about multiple intelligence theories. We mentioned, we just saw Ken Robinson, but this goes back obviously to Gardner and a variety of other people. But now we know that what we call multiple intelligence learning, or Carol Tomlinson calls it differentiated learning, demands that we start to go ahead and recognize that the brain is far more integrated and far more collective in its processes. And so the growth-minded constructs of Dweck basically say that all intelligence can be grown. And so this is a really critical kind of cornerstone to the way we look at teaching and learning. So as we look at the conversion of the scientific problem-solving methodologies, we see that disciplinary specialization and scholarly process still have a place, but we also need to understand that the search for standardized outcomes and learning reliance on extrinsic values like grades and singular processes do not acknowledge the artistic capacities of our young scientists, our future mathematicians. We have to recognize that it's very possible that someone might think in colors and they might process things by virtue of sound, and they might be able to go ahead and articulate a value and a view, which is why, Einstein went into that modality of playing his violin and moving away of using actual prayer and meditation as a means of trying to open himself up whenever there was a problem, and allowing himself that time to imagine what else could be out there. Okay. And then the other thing that flies directly in contradiction to particularly the argumentation that is part of the kind of that critical thinking mindset, that kind of polarization of thoughts. I say potato and immediately you want to argue and say potato, or I say Republican, you want to say Democrat, or whatever it is. We want to get into this kind of idea of community-based problem solving and integrated problem solving. And this values improvisation, it values artistry, creative altruism, it values humility, and encourages and rewards mistakes. And so we'll recognize that as we begin to go ahead and encourage and nurture these mindsets of improvisation and problem solving as demanding us making mistakes and actually valuing that, and particularly what many people in the health profession refer to as cultural humility, that willingness to imagine that people from other cultures might look at the value of problem solving in a particular math class, or the manner by which we teach science in a completely different way based on their collective views, but based on their history, on their cultural assets. One good example is kind of an alternative to argumentative thinking is the Native American belief in circular consultation. And so almost all Native cultures, particularly in Native North America, have a belief in circular consultation, collaborative structures. And in this view, everyone in a roundhouse or in a talking circle, very often we call it, will put their idea and their belief into the circle using humility. I believe, I think, this is my premise. And then everybody puts that into the circle, and then out of that, the community then decides what is valuable. But the key component here is everybody inputting their idea into the circle disowns themselves from their belief or from their thought. Therefore, there is no sense to argue and no sense of diminution if it's not accepted or it's not taken, if their view is not taken. They want the best for the collective. And so therefore, by not owning what their belief and not owning their viewpoint, there is no need for argumentation, nor is there any need for feeling shamed or dishonored by a decision that is in contradiction to what they believed. And so there's an example of kind of a new way of looking at problem solving that demands indigenous cultures. And without them, you don't have that viewpoint. All right, I'm gonna just pause for a little second now. Let's go ahead and take a stop and see if anybody has any thoughts that they'd like to go ahead and share, or any questions or comments. Just because I've talked too much, I need a break.
Michael, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Great. This is a tough question, but you're the perfect person to answer it. I've always wondered, and I think many scientists have wondered too, why do humans like music so much? What is it about music that draws us in, that makes us dedicate our lives to it? And one of the neat things is it seems as if the music is actually pouring out of you when you're lecturing. I noticed there was a lovely rhythm that came in and I could hear the music, and I said to myself, I wish I could lecture like that. But that's my question to start us off.
That's a good question. I'm going to turn to the other Michael Naylor here that's on this conference call, and see what you might have to say to that, because I know you said you're an artist as well as a scientist. I'll see what you come up with, and then I might add on to it.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer your question, Dan, about what makes us make music, but I was thinking very much about talking about mistakes, how important they are, and you got me thinking. There's a couple different kinds of mistakes. One of them is the kind like when you're playing music and you play something wrong, but oh, that's interesting, and it's something you might not have found before, and it can generate new ideas. Your mistakes that bring you somewhere else. The other mistakes are those, there was a real interesting study. I want to try to find this on my computer. I have a print of this, that with brain scans, they found, they gave people English and math problems. I believe they did this in France while scanning the brain. And they found when people make mistakes, there's a part of the brain that lights up.
Right.
And at that moment is an opportunity to grow these neural connections.
Yeah.
But if you don't do anything with it, if you're like, and move on, it fades away.
Yeah.
And if you stop and reflect on that, you grow way more than if you were doing the right thing all the time. So this idea that making mistakes can actually physically change our brain and make us way smarter, and how important mistakes are, and how afraid we are to make them. So I don't know, back to you, Michael. I think there's something.
Sure. No, that's good. Those are good viewpoints, Michael. Thank you. So Daniel, obviously I can't answer your question in scientific terms, because we're just discovering a lot about the brain and the way the brain works to music, and I'm about ready to play a little video. But I can say this: we know that music is a combination of vibration and a combination of rhythms and patterns that have a social and cultural context to it. So they're basically ways by which we reflect on our human experience. And I believe that scientists are particularly predisposed to seeking balance to the scientific disciplines. And so that's why I find that, many scientists and mathematicians and people value music, in some cases even more than musicians do, in terms of listening, because there's that need for balance, that a need to emote, that need to feel, that need to have this kind of context, because so much of the work they do on a day-to-day basis is in the brain. It's behind the computer. It's in these other areas. I think increasingly as we begin to integrate our disciplines and we begin to have collaborations like we're doing right here, that we'll find out more and more about how compatible the human brain is to science and art, to creativity, to vibration, to all these different things. And we'll see a merging of our disciplines because, again, we've been practicing the mindset. And I like to use Newton's third law, is that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction in the constructs of education. That means when we've been practicing a way of learning based on the industrial model for long enough, we get really good at that model, but there are other models and we'll have to push kind of equally and opposite against that to be able to build up new ways of learning. And so I have a feeling that the natural instinct for the mathematician and the scientist is to be able to seek that balance. And you know, the vast majority of the scientists and mathematicians I know do listen to music. In some cases, a lot.
Michael, I should mention to you, thank you actually. Because a lot of your students come into astronomy, and just last term, one of the students made a song about a lecture topic he had just heard. And he tried to convey the information through the song. And I still have the recording and I'll share it with you at some point. But it was just interesting when you were talking about how people learn in different ways. Yeah. And for him, the best way to express it and to communicate it is by creating a song with notes and everything.
Yeah. Oh, that's perfect. Dan, that's, well, so we don't know how we're going to do this because we've been using the industrial model of education, which is standardized exams and whatever. And so particularly you folks in STEM have the greatest kind of heavy lifting to do on this. Is how are you going to be able to take that potential scientist who really uses colors and sight, or uses sound, or see, or goes through the world with particular intelligences different than those you test on the current exam formulas? How are you going to liberate those? And you know, I haven't got any solutions for you, because as long as you have to promote somebody through certain, you know, through calculus to whatever it is that comes after it, you're going to have to kind of work that through. But in any case, we know we're on this pathway. So I'm going to go ahead and play a little video here just to kind of head on through. This is a video that talks about the brain on music, and particularly kind of pushes against this belief that we have this kind of polarized brain function.
Did you know that every time musicians pick up their instruments, there are fireworks going off all over their brain? On the outside, they may look calm and focused, reading the music and making the precise and practiced movements required. But inside their brains, there's a party going on. How do we know this? Well, in the last few decades, neuroscientists have made enormous breakthroughs in understanding how our brains work by monitoring them in real time with instruments like fMRI and PET scanners. When people are hooked up to these machines, tasks such as reading or doing math problems each have corresponding areas of the brain where activity can be observed. But when researchers got the participants to listen to music, they saw fireworks. Multiple areas of their brains were lighting up at once as they processed the sound, took it apart to understand elements like melody and rhythm, and then put it all back together into unified musical experience. And our brains do all this work in the split second between when we first hear the music and when our foot starts to tap along. But when scientists turn from observing the brains of music listeners to those of musicians, the little backyard fireworks became a jubilee. It turns out that while listening to music engages the brain in some pretty interesting activities, playing music is the brain's equivalent of a full-body workout. The neuroscientists saw multiple areas of the brain light up, simultaneously processing different information in intricate, interrelated, and astonishingly fast sequences. But what is it about making music that sets the brain alight? The research is still fairly new, but neuroscientists have a pretty good idea. Playing a musical instrument engages practically every area of the brain at once, especially the visual, auditory, and motor cortices. And as with any other workout, disciplined, structured practice in playing music strengthens those brain functions, allowing us to apply that strength to other activities. The most obvious difference between listening to music and playing it is that the latter requires fine motor skills, which are controlled in both hemispheres of the brain. It also combines the linguistic and mathematical precision in which the left hemisphere is more involved with the novel and creative content that the right excels in. For these reasons, playing music has been found to increase the volume and activity in the brain's corpus callosum, the bridge between the two hemispheres, allowing messages to get across the brain faster and through more diverse routes.
Okay, I'll just stop there. Obviously, that's a little bit music centric, so I apologize for focusing on my own discipline there. But if we look at, I want to look at just in addition to the brain science, which is emerging. In particular, there's some wonderful studies that relate not only to playing music but improvising, the ability to be able to put things out and try things without knowing where they're going. And this is what Michael was also talking about: the ability to make mistakes, and in making mistakes, try new ideas, which is a critical component to STEM, a very, an extremely important thing that cannot be shoved and mandated into, again, that standardized formula on outcomes. If you look at the kind of the left side, here's just a little comparative model: the scientific method: ask a question, research the topic, form a hypothesis, test your hypothesis, observe your data and draw conclusions, share your report and your findings. This is, of course, this has a foundation, and many of these practices will continue on. If you look at one of the models for the artistic process, you still find this inspiration, but to find the inspiration is also somewhat linked to that sense of altruism. I need to be driven by something that I believe is going to make a difference in the world, not just a question or a problem. So if I have, if the question or problem is how can I create a drug that can make money for Pfizer, or that somehow or another addresses a symptom and not necessarily the cause, that is in fact a question, and it certainly can be channeled through, and I might come up with a wonderful outcome for Pfizer's bottom line. But is that the kind of inspiration that is ultimately going to change or be beneficial to humanity? So research ideas and methods and techniques, we still have to do that. We have to think about like what's behind. But the biggest key component here is the brainstorming and practicing of techniques, the creative work, and I'm going to introduce kind of another model for this, and that is improvisation. The willingness to put things out, because every single composition starts out as an improvisation. And so, in fact, does every scientific solution. It starts out as an improvisation. The key component is for scientists to think of themselves as improvisers. That is, being willing to put multiple ideas out and think different things and collaborate with people from other disciplines that may not seem part of their particular discipline. Because as we say in music, if you want to write a new hip hop piece, you want to write a new string quartet, and all you listen to are hip hop or string quartets, you're not going to have a great diversity in your creativity or in your composition, because you're locked to the genre of your particular discipline. But if you want to really do a fascinating brand new type of hip hop, listen to string quartet music or opera or country music or better yet, Indian rags or whatever else, because now you're out beyond your discipline. You're out gathering insights and input that you would never otherwise imagine. And so this ability to think of ourselves as learning communities that are highly evolved in our perpetuation of improvisation is critical. You might look at composition. We look at composition a little bit differently than this particular model here. But we basically say that the first thing is that I make an observation. I have something I want to write, something I want to say. And the deeper my power of observation is, the more I look below the surface. So the key component there is, am I questioning? Am I being, remember that disciplined nonconformist, am I enough of a nonconformist to be able to look at things that other people are not imagining? And then I reflect on this. And this is where that aspect of kind of having a higher vision, plugging into my intuition or a power or a spirit, something, imagining something. I always think if I if I remove that reflection process, I'm removing myself from the capacity to be able to imagine that I can do something, you know, even greater or even bigger, even different, more different than what is currently out there. And then the key component for us is that when we write songs or make compositions, we don't just grab the first thing that we compose or do. I mean, very seldom. I've had a few compositions that may have been divine inspiration per se. They have, you know, they came to me and I couldn't imagine doing them anything different. But the key component that we now do is we teach people to throw out multiple melodies, throw out multiple artistic processes, throw out multiple possibilities for solving cancer. Okay, and imagine as many different ways of doing this, and then begin the process of refinement. So as an example, I'll go back to the cancer. I'm not obviously an oncologist, but you know, if we're looking in the area of molecular structures and molecular problems, and we're not solving the problem of cancer, it may be because we're not being inclusive of environment and diet and other kinds of things. So it may be that the largest scope of community is not present in our discussion. And so it's going to be hard to solve a problem because we don't have the full scope of all the tools that are there. All right, so that's just kind of a way of looking at these processes. And then as we look at performance art in particular, we're always looking at working and learning communities. And so that's why I can't imagine us not having the sciences and the arts faculty together. To me, it's just like, you know, why would we not want to be working in the same departments and working in the same fields? Because as long as we're isolated in departments and divisions, we can't possibly have this very, very needed dialogue. As an example, try to tell my artists to try to become more disciplined in the way they look at their artistry, okay? I very much miss the voices of scientists coming in and saying, well, here's how we do this, and here's how we do this, because that lack of discipline is going to sabotage their creative abilities. You have to have discipline with your nonconformity. All right, so here's just a couple little quotes to kind of, you know, maybe kind of spur us on from my two favorite scientists, artists. Again, Albert Einstein, he says the most valuable thing a teacher can impart to children is not knowledge, but a longing for knowledge and understanding and appreciation for intellectual values, whether they be artistic, scientific, or moral. It is the supreme art of the teacher to awaken joy in creative expression and knowledge. And then he goes on to say, imagination is more important than knowledge. The revolution introduced me to art, and in turn, art introduced me to the revolution. This is that nonconformity. In other words, you can't come up with anything that solves a world problem if you're not willing to be a nonconformist. And we have to teach that aspect of nonconformity. I can't tell you how many times I have people take my music appreciation class where we're trying to teach that kind of creative mindset. And the constant thing is, what am I being graded on? You know, what's the outcome? You know, and we're putting problems out to them where there isn't a solution. There is only a process. And then these are two of my favorite quotes, one of which I've already cited, but Dr. King says, modern man has brought this whole world to an awe-inspiring threshold of the future. He has reached new and astonishing peaks of scientific success. He has produced machines that think and instruments that peer into the unfathomable ranges of interstellar space. Yet in spite of these spectacular strides in science and technology, something basic is missing. There is a sort of poverty of the spirit which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The richer we are becoming materially, the poorer we have become morally and spiritually. We have learned to fly the air like birds and swim the sea like fish, but we have not learned the simple art of living together as brothers. And then again, he says, the hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined nonconformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood. So this aspect of altruism is critical to us. So I'm going to kind of leave with just this little kind of, I would say, admonition that artists, if you look on the right-hand side, this is the kind of the tree of artistry, the way we look at artistry, this aspect of motivation, what pushes us and drives us is this idea of having a fundamental belief in the well-being of the world, expressing and finding other things that others ignore, and serving humanity based on the age of our lifespan. And altruism is this belief in or practice of a selfless concern for the well-being of others. When this is driving our science, when this is driving our arts, it serves humanity above profit and material gain, because we have this underlying motivation to continue to work through the problems, to work with others, to not try to own our thoughts or ideas, but share them with others openly. Because obviously, if I have a piece of the truth, but that piece of the truth is taken as the truth, it's no longer the truth. And we can see this everywhere in science and everywhere in our world today, is that the collaborative is not given the kind of the emphasis of focus. And so I'll just leave with this last little quote, because I think this is an homage to the artistic scientists. The man of science is perceiving and endowed with vision, whereas he who is ignorant and neglectful of this development is blind. The investigating mind is attentive, alive. A scientific man is a true index and representative of humanity, for through processes of inductive reasoning and research, he is informed of all that appertains to humanity, its status, conditions, and happenings. He studies the human body politic, understands social problems, and weaves the web of and texture of civilization. In fact, science may be likened to a mirror wherein the infinite forms and images of existing things are revealed and reflected. And that's all I got. It's 1:51, so that's close to 2. So does anybody have any thoughts or comments, any perspectives you'd like to go ahead and share? And I haven't been looking at the chat room at all because I just didn't have the bandwidth for that. So I'll do that while anybody's making comments to see if there were any.
I have another 2 questions for you, Michael.
Great, sure.
Okay. So one of the things that I've noticed at the college is, and more broadly in the West, is that the K-12 system needs reform, big reform. For example, in the math standings, the top countries are on the list, are all in Asia: Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, etc. My question to you is, how would you reform, or what immediate thing would you recommend they do to the K-12 system to perhaps improve this idea of both creativity and critical thinking? Yeah. I have some ideas on the rigor side, on the math side, but I agree with you that you need that other component there to inspire, to motivate, to get them to think outside the box, to not be so rigid, right. Make mistakes, right. Learn from mistakes, to improvise, to want to leap forward. Well,
first of all, I think that those are really good questions, and the more STEM people that are thinking this way and asking those questions, the closer, first of all, we'll get to solutions. But I'm going to channel my son now, who's working on his PhD in creative education, because a lot of what I've said here, I actually pilfered from him anyway. So I want to go ahead and acknowledge him. The first thing is the statistics on Asian success in STEM fields, and particularly in math, are a little bit skewed because of this enormous sense of discipline that is focused in their schools. And although I applaud some of that discipline is not tempered to creative problem solving, nor is it tempered to creating a balance between education and creative enjoyment of life and balance and things like this. So again, if you have a standardized testing process, and people who are excelling at that standardized testing process are people who are putting more time and effort and energy and a sense of discipline, you will learn this because your instructor has told you this, and that is your obligation based on the cultural dynamics. That doesn't necessarily mean you're teaching better math people. Better problem solvers or creative thinkers in the area of math. Now, discipline is needed. And there's no doubt that we're struggling in discipline because we've got so many things that are out there that our students can hang out in, you know, video games and all the things that they can divert their energy and time to, that the ability to be able to go ahead and not multitask to the extent that the brain cannot learn and process information and solve problems is a critical problem we all face. Discipline is necessary. But if we look at nonconformity and the idea of creativity, this is a discipline too. And when you give standardized exams that do not allow for the possibility of problem solving and multiple answers or multiple possibilities, or you don't allow for verbal narratives and visual narratives and other kinds of ways of applying intelligence, especially based on cultural assets, a Native American comes in with a completely different vision of math and the purpose of math, or somebody from, you know, the Congo or something. And so when we miss this opportunity of engaging cultural assets and multiple dynamics of the way people learn, we also miss being able to honor their intelligences, if that makes any sense. Now, as far as K through 12, this is another kind of a difficult narrative because people in education are basically saying K through 12 teachers, many of them know that the industrial model of its standardized exams is broken, but their job is to prepare people for the university. And the university has to change. So if you change the model of what we're shooting for, then K through 12 has a different opportunity to change the manner by which we get there. Right now, the model of standardized exams is still there in the university, and everybody in K through 12 is trying to hit that model. Change what we're heading to, and then watch all these creative teachers that already know that people learn differently and are ready to change. Watch how quickly curriculum changes in the K through 12 thing. That's, I guess, the theory in education. I don't know how they're going to solve that because it is a chicken and egg scenario, but it's an interesting thought.
Michael,
Yeah.
I was in grad school and I took an art class, and it was on biological illustration. And I was the only biology person in this class. The rest of them were already, you know, artists. And I can't even tell you how much I learned from this group of people.
Yeah.
And they were doing beautiful things. I was doing not so beautiful things. However, I had one piece I was super proud of. And we had this show at the end, and they were all pointing everyone to the one piece that I managed to pull off. But I guess the reason I'm telling you this story is that, do you realize that artists, in terms of identification of new species, have played a huge part because the way they're looking at things, sometimes they catch details that biologists aren't catching visually.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
Well, so there's a few things that you said, Susan. First of all, just the way you approach science and the fact that we're even here today is because of you to a large extent. In other words, these experiences in artistry are getting you to start to imagine that science and art can be compatible and we can have these dialogues. Secondly, what you also went through in that process was this ability to not compare yourself. So this idea of extrinsic outcomes is extremely linked to the dysfunctional model of industrialized learning. I compare my insides with somebody else's outsides. Okay, so I'm comparing my ability to learn with someone else who has been doing this for a long time, rather than engaging in the process and knowing that engaging in the process, I can make these mistakes, and these mistakes I don't need to condemn because they're not as good. And they eventually, if I step back from them, I begin to start to find that there's much more beauty in there than I ever allowed for, which is that piece that everybody pointed to. Okay, like while you were saying it's not good enough, everybody else was saying, oh no, it is really good, because you're coming from a completely different viewpoint that they couldn't imagine.
That's right.
Yeah, so that's beauty.
That's right. Ajane, hi. So what do you think, Ajane?
I mean, like,
I'm putting you on the spot.
Of anything, Ajane.
Like when I like doing art a lot, so like when I do art, it helps me focus and like bring my creativity out on a piece of paper.
Good. Yeah, well, so you're not alone. Einstein did that too. It's maybe not with art, but I think that idea of reflection. Are you going into a STEM field, Ajane? No? What are you going into?
I like cooking, actually. I like
Cooking.
doing that stuff.
Okay, good. Well, there's an example of a perfect merging of science and arts. Okay. Take it from one who is not an exceptional cook, but still cooks. Okay. The knowledge of acids and the knowledge of spices and the knowledge of what goes and what works and what doesn't work and what is palatable and what digests better and all this kind of stuff. That's all science. And the artistry is in the manner by which it looks, the manner by which it smells, the manner by which it blends, and all that. And so, again, culinary arts is the culinary part is the science, and the art is the manner of the presentation. So there's a perfect example of the blending of science and art. Yeah. And I'm very bad at the science of cooking. So
Actually, my father is a chef.
Oh, is he?
Yes, and we often joke that the difference between him and I in our professions is one letter. So I'm an astronomer, he's a gastronomer. And the funniest thing is that in mixing all these ingredients, and sometimes often improvising, he often comes up with unique dishes. And I find that kind of knowledge also translates into his musical ear.
Yeah.
So oftentimes when I'm playing music, I'll make a mistake and nobody else will notice but Dad.
Right.
And he'll say, well, what about that section? You should practice that more. But anyway,
no,
there seems to be a great synergy between the two.
Yeah, I think, just as to close, because it's at 2:00, but I would say just, going off that comment, Daniel, one of the biggest changes that we'll have to make as we look towards the future of education, not just for STEM and not just for the arts and not just of the merging of STEM and arts, but is this ability to think in an disciplinary modality, to be able to think in the diversity of the world of cultures and what we refer to as cultural assets, and to be able to explore this merging of disciplines, because it's kind of in a way that we've separated the disciplines and kind of like Humpty Dumpty. Now we're trying to put it back together, and there isn't enough of emphasis on that. And so we're wondering why it is we can't come up with new ideas and can't inspire, our students to want to be self-motivated in learning. And part of the process is just that we're isolated from each other. And I think, if we can find ways to have these kinds of dialogues, it won't take us long to put Humpty back together again. But in the meantime, we're kind of isolated from each other. And I don't know that's to our benefit. Susan, I'm going to turn it back to you. Thank you guys for coming. I hope any of this made some sense. And if not, I apologize.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was great.
Thank you. Yes, it was wonderful. And thank you for everyone who attended. We really appreciate you taking the time on a Saturday afternoon. And I see Melinda. Hi, Melinda.
Hi, Melinda.
Hi, how are you?
I'm going to stop.